You have a rescue story in your life. I imagine after the effects of Hurricane Helene, there are people around the country that can say, yes, I have rescue. I saw those folks at the top of that hospital in, Western North Carolina, or in Tennessee, that they were literally taking baskets down and rescuing them from a roof of a hospital. We've seen those pictures this week. I'm wondering if you have a rescue story, a time in your life, a moment in time where someone or something literally saved you from death or serious injury. John Piper wrote this about a childhood experience of rescue. He says, when I lost footing as a little boy in the undertow at Daytona Beach, I felt as if I were going to be dragged into the middle of the ocean in an instant. It was a terrifying thing. I tried to get my bearings and figure out which way was up, but I couldn't get my feet on the ground, and the current was too strong to swim, and I wasn't a good swimmer anyway. In my panic, I thought of only one thing. Could someone help me? But I couldn't even call out from under the water. When I felt then my father's hand take hold of my upper arm like a mighty vice grip, it was the sweetest feeling in the world. It hurt. But I yielded entirely to being overpowered by his strength. I reveled in being picked up at his will. I did not resist. The thought did not enter my mind that I should try to show that things aren't so bad, that I didn't need his help, or that I should even add my strength to my dad's arm. All I thought was, yes, I need you. I thank you. I love your strength. I love your initiative. I love your grip. You are great, and I am safe. I wonder if this is how God's people felt in the rescue story of Exodus. Completely helpless. And yet often we are told, saved by the strong arm of their Father. The strong arm of God. Completely helpless, and yet feeling the strong vice grip of God upon them. If you're just joining us this morning, we're taking a really fast journey through the book of Exodus this fall. And we're taking that fast journey through the book of Exodus to see two things. To see the rescue of God and the reset of his people. And we are at, you're here on a good week, right? Because you're here at one of the climactic points, right, of this rescue story. God's people were in slavery to the Egyptians, an undertow of cataclysmic proportions. Moses has returned with a message from God that he was there to set them free. And it was a voice from beyond the pain with a promise that they would be saved. Then we saw it got worse before it got better. And last week we saw in 9 of the 10 plagues, initiated by God, that God is powerful, that he is judge, and yet he is gracious. The rescue has begun. The painful grip of God was on them, but they are relieved as they feel themselves being rescued from an even greater grip of evil. And it brings us this morning to the 10th and final plague. We'll be turning this morning in a number of verses in Exodus, between Exodus 11 and 13. So if you have your Bibles, good on you. That's awesome. Turn there. Exodus chapter 11, second book of the Bible. Exodus chapter 11. If you didn't bring Bibles this morning, it's okay. We got one for you in the pew. That black book in the pew, on page 53, you'll find where we're at this morning in Exodus 11. Or if you indeed like to cheat and use your phone, you can do that as well. 3 thoughts as you turn there. 3 thoughts this morning as we work our way through these chapters. I want you to see that God is going to tell the Hebrew people, the Israelites, what it is that he's going to do. And then he does it, and then he tells them, I don't want you to forget. I want you to remember this moment. Let's begin with chapter 11, the beginning, and looking at how God says this is going to happen. Now, if you remember from last week, God often, through the 10 plagues, begins to give them a hint of what is about to come, especially Moses and Aaron, right? So listen, this is what's going to happen. You're going to take the staff, you're going to hit the water, it's going to turn into blood, right? And then they go and they do it, right? But here in chapter 11, in the 10th plague, it feels as if God is, in this climactic point, he's taking almost a kind of a dramatic pause, and he's building so much more around this 10th plague, so that the people of God would understand, and that Moses and Aaron would understand the reality of the importance of what is about to happen. It's a dramatic pause as we go into the 10th plague, and the ways in which the people of God are instructed to prepare for this particular plague are included in it. But let's look at this in chapter 11 first. I want you to see first, in God saying that this is going to happen, the first thing that he says is that I've made you great. That I've made you great. Look at chapter 11, verses 1 through 3. The Lord said to Moses, "Yet one plague more I will bring upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. Afterward, he will let you go from here. And when he lets you go, he will drive you away completely. Speak now in the hearing of the people that they ask, every man of his neighbor and every woman of her neighbor, for silver and gold jewelry." And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants, and in the sight of the people. First see that God has made his people great. That he makes beginnings to make some sense of the first 9 plagues, because it's through them that God has made the Hebrews great in the sight of their captors. Don't miss this. While Pharaoh refuses to see the power of God in the plagues, the people of Egypt seem well aware, right? I mean, you read in this text that as they are asked for things like silver and gold from the Israelites, that they are more than willing to give them. Why? Because they have this great respect for the people, and they have a great respect for the people because they have a great respect for the power of their God. That even Pharaoh is told here, right? That he has respect. Remember, this is the guy that didn't even want to come. He's the guy with the stutter problem. He's the guy with the speech problem. He's the guy with the confidence problem. Didn't even want to come. God says, you got to go. I ain't going. No, you got to send somebody else. Okay, I'll send Aaron with you. Okay, here you go. This is the guy that's muttering along, stuttering along. And here we hear at the end of 9 plagues, as we enter into the 10th plague, that Moses is one by all of Pharaoh's people. It's a man of great respect. Has he somehow had a schooling experience in this time? No. He has a great God who has shown his power, shown his judgment, and shown his grace. And they see that in the person of Moses. God has made his people great. Also see that God has made his people distinct. In the preparation stages, when God says this is going to happen, he says, don't only look at the fact that I've made you great, but I've made you distinct. Here are the details from God with regard to the final plague. Look at starting in verse 4. Moses said, "Thus says the Lord, about midnight I will go out in the midst of Egypt, and every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die. From the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on the throne, even to the firstborn of the slave girl who's behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of the cattle. There shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as there has never been, nor ever will be again. But not a dog shall growl against any of the people of Israel, either man or beast, that you may listen, that you may know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. And all these your servants shall come down to me and bow down to me, saying, Get out, you and all the people who follow you. And after that I will go out." Hear this. Hear the details from God with regard to these final moments of this final plague. Now, they sound horrific, right? The reality of the death of the firstborn. If you watch the 10 Commandments, right? Somebody last week said, every time you preach through this, all I can see is Charlton Heston, right? Those of you who've seen, like, You watch this, and it's horrific. The reality of the death of children, the death of adults, what is happening here is hard. And yet, in it we see the promise of God. Why does God do this? Look in verses 7 and 8. We do see the plan of God at work to rescue his people. The horror of this plague becomes the final straw that will set God's people free. People of God, we will not ever answer all of the questions of the horrific nature of this, but we can see clearly that God is at the center of it. And he's doing so to make his name great and to bring a distinction in his people. An obvious distinction made between the people of God and the people not of God. The power of God leads not just to an escape, but as God has said all along, Egypt and Pharaoh will thrust the people of God from the land. God has made his people distinct. He's made his people great. He's made his people distinct. And the final thing that we gloriously see in this text as he prepares them for what is about to happen is that God has made a way. God has made a way. Here's the very special way that God has the Hebrews prepare for this night of death. Chapter 12, verses 1 through 13. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his nearest neighbor shall take according to the number of persons, according to that which can each, you shall make your account for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight. Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that night, roasted on the fire with unleavened bread, and bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat any of its raw, boiled in water, but roasted, its head with its legs and its inner parts. And you shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn. In this manner you shall eat it. With your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. You shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments, for I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you in the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." God makes a way. Listen, death is coming. Even for the Hebrews, death is deserved. But for the people of God, there is a way made. A way for death to pass over. You heard it there, right? The people are to sacrifice the lamb, to take the blood of the lamb and put it on the portals, the doorposts of their house. They're to roast the lamb. Some of you are getting hungry for Sunday lunch when I say that, right? They are to roast the lamb and eat the lamb. They need nourishment for the day that is about to happen, for the night that is coming, the escape that is on the very verge of happening. Be ready, he says, for the Lord is coming to bring death to some, certainly. Oh, but to you people of God, he's coming to bring life, to bring deliverance, to bring freedom from slavery. Now, it is clear here that the Lord is speaking only to Moses, and then Moses and Aaron about all of this. But can you imagine getting the email that day from Moses and Aaron? Right? Subject line: it's time. Right? The body of the email: hey, fasten your belts. God's bringing death on the firstborn of Egypt. But listen carefully. To avoid death, you need to kill a spotless lamb and paint his blood on your doorposts. Make some unleavened bread. Eat the lamb for nourishment and get ready, because this is how we get out. This is our rescue. Love Moses and Aaron. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, it wasn't emailed. You do know that, right? They shared it with the elders, and the elders shared it with the people. And the reality of that amazing moment in which hundreds of thousands of people begin to hear this amazing news of grace. Scary. Maybe hurtful, right? This vice grip hurts. The reality of death is coming. But I have made a way that as death comes, you will find life. You will find freedom. Rescue is coming. And it's by the blood of the Lamb. God has made his people great. God has made his people distinct. Even more, he's made a way for their rescue. God says all of this is going to happen. Then, it happens. Right? It's almost a repeat of the reality of what we heard was coming. But pay attention to something. Don't miss this, and maybe the familiarity of the story. When God says it's going to happen, it what? It happens. Right? We see this on repeat in the scriptures. His threats are not idle. His promises are not empty. Listen to chapter 12, verses 29 through 42. It happens at midnight. The Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians. And there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. Then he summoned Moses and Aaron by night and said, "Get up! Go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel. Go, serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds, as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also." So the Egyptians said, "Let's form a committee to make sure this is really right." They weren't Presbyterian. No, the Egyptians were urgent with the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, "We shall all be dead." So the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls being bound up in their cloaks on their shoulders. The people of Israel had also done as Moses told them, for they had asked the Egyptians for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they let them have whatever they asked. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. And the people of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, not to mention women and children. A mixed multitude also went up with them, and very much livestock, both flocks and herds. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough that they brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were thrust out of Egypt and could not wait. Nor had they prepared any provisions for themselves. And in the summary statement, the time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, on that very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. It was night of watching by the Lord to bring them out of the land of Egypt. So this same night is a night of watching kept to the Lord by all the people of Israel throughout their generations. Listen, it happens. God says it's going to happen. And it happens. There is certain judgment here. As Egypt killed the firstborn males of the Hebrews back when Moses' life was at risk, right? They said, hey, the firstborn of every Hebrew home would be thrown into the Nile. Just as Egypt killed the firstborn males of the Hebrews, the Lord now kills the firstborn of the Egyptians. And it becomes the climax of the deliverance of his people. God, listen, has victory over evil. There is certain judgment, but there is certain grace. The Hebrews did not deserve to live. Their deliverance is in the grace of God, who provided them a way to freedom. God delivers his people not on condition of their goodness, but unconditionally by his grace. 430 years has passed since they came to Egypt. And an original 70 people have become 600,000 men plus women and children, well over 1 million. They had suffered greatly, but they see on this day that God is faithful. Listen, even to go back to catch the story of the Bible to this point, as Adam in the Garden of Eden experiences the curse in the garden, he is promised by God that there is a day when evil will be stepped on, conquered. In the 10th plague, we see that in parts. Abraham in Genesis 12, Genesis 15 was promised a great nation by God, more descendants than the stars in the sky, and as the people of God are set to leave, we see this promise in part. Over 1 million people fleeing the land of Egypt. God told Moses it would happen, and it happened, but let's not miss something that none of the other plagues had. God made it clear that He wants His people to remember this final plague for years to come. Maybe as God works out His plan for His people, He's saying, I am not quite done. Do you remember, people of God, who Moses is writing these words of Exodus to? I'll wake you up for just a second and ask you to respond. Who is it that Moses is writing to? It's the people in the wilderness, right? That they're wandering, it's a generation removed. In fact, it's probably the people set to go into the promised land. So they've already wandered in the desert for 40 years, right? They're set to go into the promised land. And Moses is writing this history. We see in this history, though, commentary, communication throughout these chapters of the final plague. Not about what just happened, but how the people are to remember what has happened. In chapter 12, as the Lord gives instruction to the people before the final plague, He's already telling them, this day shall be for you a memorial day, and you shall keep it as a feast of the Lord. Or the end of verse 17, you shall observe this day throughout your generations as a statute forever. In chapter 13, after the final plague, Moses says to the people, remember this day in which you came out of the house of slavery, for by a strong hand the Lord brought you out from this place. And the instructions for a repeated feast are given, the feast of unleavened bread. Later in chapter 13, there are instructions about how you consecrate the firstborn. From that day on, every firstborn male animal was sacrificed. And for every firstborn child, they should be redeemed by the sacrifice of a lamb. And I love chapter 13, verse 14. Moses, very practically, is thinking about a day, maybe even the day in which he lives as they're ready to go into the promised land. And he says, hey, the kids someday are going to ask, why in the world do we sacrifice a lamb every time a firstborn is born? Why is it that we get together for this Passover feast on the first month, the 14th day? Why is it that we eat unleavened bread? Can't we throw some leaven back in? I think it's much better when it puffs up. Why do we do this? That's going to come. Kids ask questions. Moses says, when they ask, you shall say to him, is to remember that by a strong hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt from the house of slavery. So remembering was about looking back and reflecting on what it is that God had done, the goodness, the faithfulness of God, the power of God, so that we might move forward and trust Him more. But as we would see in the story of the Bible, it was not just about looking back. This final plague was also about looking forward as well. You've heard me talk before about the reality of looking in the rearview mirror so that we might better look out the windshield, right? The reality that sometimes we have to look at where we've been in order to better be prepared to go where we're going. And I think the Passover, this 10th plague, is capturing both of those. And I had a really long part of the sermon ready to share all this, but Tim Chester did it much better than I did in just a few words. So I'm going to read from his commentary, Exodus for you. He says, in every home throughout Egypt and Goshen, the death count is the same. The following morning, there is a corpse. The only question is it a lamb or is it a child? Who has died? The lamb is a substitute for the child. If blood were simply marking out Israelite homes, then red paint would have done the job. But the blood is a sign that a sacrifice has been made, that a substitute has been offered. So the sacrifice of a lamb means there is unfinished business. After all, who really thinks a lamb is a fair exchange for a human life? The lamb is simply a pointer. It's an embodied promise of a true substitute. The Passover is the sign of a greater act of redemption. And sure enough, over a millennium later, with this unfinished business still waiting to be resolved, John the Baptist sees Jesus. It says what? Behold, this is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. A few years later, Peter would say, for you know that it was not with perishable things such as silver or gold that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your ancestors, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. Paul describes Christ as our Passover lamb. Jesus is our Passover lamb. He was sacrificed as our substitute. We all deserve to die because of our rebellion against God, but Jesus has died in our place. His blood is, as it were, daubed over our lives so that God will pass over us when he comes in judgment. As a result, we are redeemed. Like Israel, we are redeemed from slavery and death. But not slavery in Egypt. Slavery to sin and the penalty of death that our sin deserves. You get this, right? When God made a way for the Hebrews in Egypt, he was setting the stage for an even greater rescue. Jesus would become the lamb's sacrifice so that by his blood, death would pass over. And we, people of God, covenant church, would be rescued from the power of sin. We would be rescued from the penalty of death. It would be us in that undertow, but us feeling the firm grip of God who rescues us from death. And in the same way, the Lord tells us to remember. And you all say, wait a minute. Today's not the first Sunday of the month. We're not having communion today. This sermon's going right to communion. Where's the bread and the juice, right? This would be perfect, right? Well, there's 5 Sundays in September, and when the pastor was planning these things... But you know what? It's not all bad. We can salvage this. Are you ready? It would not be bad, ladies and gentlemen, for you all to take the week and remember that as we come here again next Sunday, Pastor Matthew takes you across the Red Sea in that final place of deliverance, then, yes, come to that table. We're not doing communion today, but we are telling the story. We're remembering the story. We're challenged to spend the week remembering that story, the narrative of how Jesus has rescued us from death. In 2013, there was an article written in the New York Times that described some research among kids that came to this conclusion. The conclusion was this: the more children knew about their family's history, the stronger their sense of control over their lives, the higher their self-esteem, and the more successfully they believed their families functioned. That remembering turns out to be the best single predictor, it said, of children's emotional health and happiness. And I say this morning, with all due respect to the New York Times, no duh. This is exactly the point of the Lord. Here in Exodus 11 through 13. Because I'm going to do this, and then I do it. But don't you forget, tell the story over and over and over again. In fact, every year, make some unleavened bread and tell your kids why. Celebrate the Passover and tell your kids why. That remembering would indeed bring spiritual health to us as people. How often do we reflect and remember? The study reported by the New York Times had what they called a do you know factor. They asked kids all kinds of questions about what they knew about their parents' and grandparents' history. And the more they knew, the more stable they were. So I ask you this morning, how much of the story do you know? How much do you know? Do we know that we have been rescued in what is the greatest rescue story ever? That the strong arm of God has reached into the undertow of our lives and grabbed us. It has held us. And it has delivered us from certain death. Do we know? Do we know Jesus is the sacrificial lamb that was crucified so that we might live, who was sacrificed as our substitute? Do we know? Do we know that the blood Christ shed is the blood placed on the doorframes of our hearts? So that death caused by our sin will pass over. Do we know? Listen, God knew your rescue story before it happened. He orchestrated it. And then He made it happen. He rescued you. And even today tells us to remember the cross, to remember the blood shed for us, to remember the moment that we prayed a prayer or came to a realization of God's love for us in Christ Jesus. But we're also today to remember, because the story is still not complete. We remember so that we might continue to wait, for the ultimate rescue of Christ's return. As John Piper remembered being rescued by his Father, not fighting, but yielding. May we do the same. To simply say yes and surrender to God's arm. To say, yes, I need you, God. I thank you, God. I love your strength. I love your initiative in my life. I love your grip. I welcome you. Surrender to me. To your rescue.